Some of my earliest and fondest memories of owning a Nintendo Entertainment System was my best friend getting Castlevania. I fell in love instantly with its gothic settings, characters inspired by classic monster movies, and its unforgettable soundtrack. I borrowed it often, and could even beat it fairly easily. So when Castlevania 2 dropped a year later, I convinced him that he needed to get it as soon as possible. He did, and I again was able to borrow it often. This one changed things up a lot, adding the ability to freely explore the world, as well as collect items to open up new areas. It was an insanely difficult game that often left me confused as to where I should go and what I should do. I still played the hell out of it because the theme and music appealed to me so much. Around that same time, my arcade got Haunted Castle, an arcade version of the Castlevania series. It had nothing to do with the NES games in regards to design, and had Dracula showing up and kidnapping Simon Belmont's wife. This one looked wildly different from what I was used to, and oh my god was it hard as hell, but I kept at it and eventually got good enough to enjoy it. When Castlevania 3 dropped in 1990, I was well on my way to supporting my Sega Genesis, but I still had to pick it up so I wouldn't miss a chance to fell the demon Count Dracula once again. And I was really glad that I did, because it was easily the finest Castlevania adventure I had experienced up until that point. It looked and played great even for an NES game, surrounded by the 16-bit efforts of Sega and NEC. The music was simply some of the finest chiptunes ever produced, and Castlevania cemented itself as a premier series that I'd always need to try upon its release. The Sega Genesis was on fire in the US, and I was anxiously awaiting when Konami would announce a Castlevania game for Sega's 16-bit powerhouse. A few Game Boy Castlevanias came and went, but nothing was showing up for the Genesis. I remained hopeful, and in 1991 Konami released Super Castlevania 4 for the Super Nintendo. This remake of the very first adventure was an absolute masterpiece of game design. Taking advantage of the glorious color palette and custom sound hardware of the Super Nintendo, it painted an impossibly beautiful game filled with detailed characters, varied locations, and gorgeous backdrops, all while a perfect atmosphere was created by its haunting musical score. It was, quite frankly, a nearly perfect Castlevania game. But I confess that I was saddened by this powerful showing on Sega's competing platform. Did this mean that Konami had no interest in doing Castlevania on the Genesis? Was the relative weakness of the Mega Drive brand in Japan the root cause? I was beginning to lose hope. My final shreds of hope were crushed when Konami released Dracula X Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM 2. The PC Engine's popularity in Japan had been strong, and Konami would bless that platform with yet another incredible Castlevania experience. Using the expanded storage of the CD-ROM format, this new Castlevania was chock full of awesome cinemas and a brand new musical score that was even better than Super Castlevania 4's. The developers would outdo themselves with the PC Engine hardware as well, with large enemies, great use of color, tons of parallax scrolling, and multiple paths to take that could lead to completely different areas and encounters. It was again, truly a game for the ages. Having given up on my dream of a Sega Castlevania game, Konami came out of nowhere with 1994's Castlevania Bloodlines, also called Vampire Killer in Japan, and Castlevania The New Generation in Europe. Finally, my dreams were realized, and my beloved Sega Genesis had a Castlevania to call its own. Konami opted for a more old-school look with this game instead of the larger characters of the other 16-bit entries in the series. They did, however, allow you to choose two radically different playing characters for the adventure: a whip-wielding descendant of the Belmont clan, and his grieving partner who lost his woman to a vampire. These partners in destiny chased down Elizabeth Bartley in her quest to revive the great Count Dracula and put a stop to it. Since both characters have wildly different attack methods, Konami put in multiple paths that each character can take, further changing how each hero offers new gameplay experiences. Despite using smaller main characters, the graphics engine is phenomenal here. Enemy design makes heavy use of multi-jointed sprites that come together to form some impressively intimidating foes. The animation also benefits from this style of visual presentation, with characters that almost look three-dimensional at times. Gameplay would of course be tried and true action platforming goodness, with responsive attacks and jumping forming the core of the experience. Later levels would even add disorienting special effects that just didn't challenge you, but looked great in the process. And while the graphics and gameplay of Bloodlines hold their own, it was its soundtrack that put it on another level entirely. Rarely has music so instantly and profoundly grabbed me as the center point of a video game experience. Every stage was defined by its musical score, telling you more about where you were and how you should feel than your eyes ever could. It drove the gameplay at an emotional level that made you sometimes feel threatened, sometimes excited, and sometimes fearing what you were about to run into. The Genesis sound chip had fared poorly in the hands of Western developers and their poor use of bog-standard sound drivers, but Michiru Yamane had harnessed the Yamaha hardware like a goddess and belted out one of the best 16-bit soundtracks that generation. She'd go on to do Castlevania Symphony of the Night, yet another masterpiece in its own right. I'd go on to play Castlevania Bloodlines many times, and enjoy it so immensely that it eventually became my favorite Genesis game of all time. The great graphical presentation combined with the tried and true Castlevania gameplay had been enough to earn my respect, but once coupled with that unforgettable music score, it simply became an unmissable classic that deserves a place on every Sega fan's shelf. If you haven't played it, consider this a glowing recommendation from one Sega fan to another. The Castlevania franchise's strength always lied in its ties to classic monster movies, and its ability to bring it all together in one package of tight gameplay and top-shelf gothic graphical and audio presentation. Castlevania Bloodlines would remain the lone exclusive member of that franchise to see a physical release on a Sega system. All these years later, I'm glad it was, because it's truly a great game that punctuated my ownership of the Genesis platform with an absolute masterpiece. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.